Saint Thérèse of Lisieux taught that one of the greatest errors a soul can fall into is thinking that what Jesus asks of us is something difficult or complex. According to her, the presence of God is not a phenomenon reserved for mystics who levitate in chapels or prophets who hear voices that shake the walls. It is not the exclusive property of the spiritually elite, the extraordinarily disciplined, or the theologically sophisticated. It is something far more intimate than any of those categories suggest, and far more available in the way that air is available, not because you have earned it or understood it or made yourself worthy of it, but because it is simply, continuously, irreducibly there. The question she spent her entire short life answering was not whether God's presence was real. The question was why so many souls, including her own on the most difficult days, could not feel what was already surrounding them completely. Have you ever been in a moment of genuine beauty, a sunset, a piece of music, the face of someone you love, and felt beneath the beauty itself something else pressing through it, something that the beauty was pointing toward but could not fully contain? Have you ever been in the depths of a suffering so complete that the normal frameworks fell away, and found in that stripped and exposed place something you did not expect? Not comfort exactly, but presence, a quality of being accompanied, that made no rational sense given the circumstances? Have you ever sat in prayer and felt, not a vision, not a voice, not any experience you could easily describe to another person, but simply a warmth that seemed to come from inside the silence rather than interrupting it? Those moments are not accidents. They are not the product of a particularly sensitive nervous system or a temporarily elevated mood. They are what Thérèse of Lisieux spent her life learning to recognize, to receive, and, in her most extraordinary contribution to Christian spirituality, to trust, even when they disappeared entirely. If the interior life is something you want to understand more deeply, subscribe now. Every week on this channel we go into the lives of the saints not to admire them but to learn from them, to take what they discovered in their specific circumstances and carry it into ours. To understand what Thérèse experienced of God's presence, you have to begin where she began, in a childhood that was, by any honest account, saturated with a quality of interiority unusual for her age. She was born in Alençon, France, in 1873, the youngest of 9 children, 5 of whom survived infancy. Her mother, Zélie, died of breast cancer when Thérèse was 4 years old. That loss, which she described in her autobiography as the first of the sorrows that shaped her, did something specific to the architecture of her interior life. It removed, at an age when most children are still entirely absorbed in the surface of things, the assumption that the visible world was sufficient. Something in the 4-year-old Thérèse understood, without having words for it, that what she could see and touch and hold was not the whole of what was real, that there was a dimension beyond the visible that was not less real but more, and that the gap left by her mother's absence had the shape of something that only that dimension could fill. She grew up sensitive in a way that was often painful. She cried easily. She felt deeply. She described herself in her early years as fragile, overly emotional, easily wounded. And then, on Christmas night of 1886, when she was 13 years old, something happened that she would later call her complete conversion. A sudden and inexplicable interior transformation in which the hypersensitivity that had characterized her childhood simply ceased to dominate her. She described it as Jesus reaching into her heart and removing the burden she had carried since her mother's death. It happened without drama, without a mystical vision, without any external sign that anyone around her could have observed. But inside her, something shifted permanently. She described emerging from that night stronger, more free, more capable of the kind of selfless love she had always desired, but had never quite been able to sustain against the weight of her own sensitivity. This is the first texture of God's presence as Thérèse experienced it. Not a vision, not a voice, but an interior transformation so specific and so complete that it could not be attributed to her own effort or development. Something had been done to her. Something had been placed in her, or removed from her, or rearranged inside her, in a way that changed the quality of her daily experience without changing any of her external circumstances. The presence of God in this first encounter that she could fully articulate felt like surgery, precise, gentle, and entirely outside her own capacity to have performed. She entered Carmel in 1888, carrying this new freedom and the consuming desire it had intensified. And what she found there, in the years that followed, was an education in the textures of God's presence that was nothing like what she had anticipated. The early years in the convent carried moments of warmth and felt nearness, moments she described with the particular precision of someone who understood, even while experiencing them, that they were gifts rather than entitlements, consolations that could be withdrawn as easily as they had been given. She did not build her spiritual life on them. She received them the way you receive unexpected kindness, with gratitude rather than expectation, with open hands rather than a grip. But she was also learning in those same early years something about the presence of God that the consolations alone could not have taught her. She was learning it through the ordinary, through the texture of daily life in a convent that was simultaneously sacred and profoundly human. She noticed that the moments when she felt closest to God were not always the moments of elevated prayer or spiritual sweetness. Sometimes they were the moments of sweeping a corridor with full attention. Sometimes they were the moments of choosing gentleness toward a sister who had been unkind to her, and feeling in that small act of choice something that could only be described as accompaniment, as if the choice itself were not entirely hers, as if the love she was expressing had a source that ran deeper than her own capacity for it. She wrote about this with an image that appears throughout her autobiography and her letters, the image of a child being carried. A very small child does not walk its own way home. It is lifted. And the experience of being lifted, of having the distance covered by a strength that is not your own, does not feel like nothing. It feels like warmth against your cheek. It feels like the particular security of a grip that does not falter. It feels like the absence of the effort that walking would have cost, replaced by something that is not the absence of sensation, but a different kind of sensation entirely. The sensation of being held. This is what she meant when she described God's presence. Not a dramatic intrusion into ordinary experience, but a quality that pervaded ordinary experience when she was paying attention. A warmth, a companionship, an accompaniment that was most reliably felt not in the moments of spiritual intensity, but in the moments of faithful smallness. When she made the bed with full attention and full love. When she walked to chapel in the cold and offered the cold. When she encountered the sister whose mannerisms drove her to the edge of patience and chose, quietly and invisibly, to smile. In those moments, she felt something she could not have manufactured, a rightness, a fit, the particular interior satisfaction of a soul doing exactly what it was made for. But then the consolations withdrew, and what replaced them was something that Thérèse described with an honesty that still unsettles people who read it expecting comfortable mysticism. She described entering in the last 18 months of her life a darkness so complete that she could no longer feel the faith she had always known as a lived experience. She wrote that the heaven she had always believed in felt, in those months, like a story she had told herself. That when she tried to reach for the certainty that had always been available to her, she found only fog. That the interior warmth that had accompanied her in the early years of Carmel had been replaced by something cold and silent and unyielding. She did not hide this. She wrote about it in letters that her superiors almost suppressed after her death, fearing that the darkness she described would scandal those who venerated her. She wrote that she was sitting at a table set with bitterness instead of sweetness, that souls who did not believe were inviting her to their table, and that she was eating their bread, sharing, in some form she could not fully understand, the experience of those who lived without any felt sense of the divine. She wrote all of this not in despair, but in something that is harder to name and more important, in a fidelity that did not require feeling in order to function. And here is what makes her account of God's presence so extraordinarily useful for anyone who has ever experienced spiritual dryness and concluded from it that something had gone wrong. Thérèse did not conclude that the darkness meant absence. She could not feel God's presence. She could not access the interior warmth that had once been reliable. She could not manufacture the consolations that had once arrived without effort. And she chose, in the most naked and unwitnessed act of faith she ever performed, to trust that the absence of feeling was not the absence of reality, that the presence of God does not depend on the soul's capacity to perceive it, that the sun does not stop existing because the clouds have covered it completely. She wrote that she would believe in the light even while seeing only darkness. She wrote this not as a spiritual achievement, but as a daily act of will, choosing, against every interior sensation that suggested otherwise, to maintain the direction of her trust. She described it once as singing in the dark, knowing the melody even when you cannot hear it, not pretending the darkness is light, not manufacturing a cheerfulness that covers the reality, but carrying the song anyway, in your body, in your choices, in the small, faithful acts of a day that feels empty of everything that makes faithfulness feel worth sustaining. This is the deepest teaching she offers about what it is like to feel God's presence. Because what she discovered in that darkness, what the darkness paradoxically revealed to her, was that the presence she had been experiencing all along was not primarily located in the consolations. It was located in something more fundamental, in the relationship itself, in the love that did not require emotional confirmation to be real, in the trust that did not require felt certainty to be genuine. The consolations had been, she understood, a kind of scaffolding, necessary and beautiful and genuinely given, but not the building. The building was the relationship, and the relationship remained standing when the scaffolding was removed, because it had been built on something that feeling could point toward, but could never itself provide. She documented, in the same period of darkness, small moments that she recognized as the presence of God, precisely because they were inexplicable by any other account. A sudden interior peace that arrived in the middle of a night of suffering and was gone by morning. A moment during Mass when the fog lifted slightly, and she felt, briefly and completely, the warmth she had almost forgotten. A quality of clarity in her understanding, not of doctrine, but of love, the specific love of a specific God for a specific, fragile, beloved soul, that came not from her own reflection, but from somewhere else, arriving in the way that all genuine gifts arrive, unexpected and unearned. She held these moments loosely. She did not build on them or inflate them or use them as evidence against the darkness. She received them the way she had learned to receive everything, with open hands, with gratitude, with the freedom of someone who has stopped requiring any particular form of God's presence as a condition for continuing to love Him. She wrote that she had reached the point where she was no longer seeking consolations from God, but seeking God Himself. And the difference between those two things she had come to understand was the difference between a relationship and an experience, between a love and a feeling, between a reality and its shadow on the wall. What does the presence of God feel like? For Thérèse, across the full arc of her 24 years, it felt like many things. It felt like the sudden liberation of a Christmas night when the hypersensitivity of years dissolved in a moment. It felt like the warmth of being carried when you are too small to walk the distance yourself. It felt like the rightness of a small act of love done in secret, and the inexplicable satisfaction of having offered it. It felt like the accompaniment of a presence that did not speak but was undeniably there, in the cold corridor, in the difficult encounter, in the sleepless night, in the laundry and the chapel and the hours between prayer and work and sleep. And then it felt like nothing, for months. It felt like a closed door in a silent room and a faith maintained entirely by will, without the assistance of any sensation that confirmed its object was real. And in that nothing, she discovered, not immediately, not easily, but finally and completely, that the presence of God is not a feeling the soul produces. It is a reality the soul inhabits, that you are inside it, whether you can feel it or not. That it surrounds you the way air surrounds you, not because you have achieved the right spiritual conditions, but because it is simply, continuously, and without condition, there. She died saying she had no regrets about having surrendered herself to love, not to the feeling of love, not to the consolations of love, to love itself, the thing beneath all the feeling and all the consolation and all the darkness, the thing that was there at the beginning and was there at the end, and she trusted with everything she had, would be there in what came after. That is what the presence of God felt like to Thérèse of Lisieux, and she would tell you, with the precision and the gentleness that characterized everything she wrote, that it feels exactly the same to you, whether you can feel it right now or not.